Okay, as my title indicates, this will be part 3 of what eventually will be a 4-part series of talks, all related to a term that I've invented, a coinage, called the Daedalus Complex. In previous talks that I've explained here and there, beginning with the quite obvious echo of Freud's Oedipus Complex, in the phrase, the Daedalus Complex, I've talked a bit about the way in which, say, with Freud, you have this triangular relationship between child, father, and mother, and with the Daedalus Complex, rather, it's the relationship between the author, the work that he's creating, and the victim, as it were, then, that he creates or that he places within his work. I talked a bit about I guess it was in an earlier one, it must have been in the first one, talked about the story of Daedalus and Icarus in Book 9 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where very clearly you have, it's kind of the origin of this idea that I had, this coinage of the Daedalus Complex, the idea that you have a victim in the form of Icarus who falls to his death because he went beyond the laws of nature and fell to his the wax, of course, melted and he fell into the sea. Remembering though that it's not only that that Icarus violated the laws of nature, he went too far, but also Daedalus himself changed. That's the phrase in the English translation. In the Odyssey, he changed the laws of nature by creating the labyrinth, which was like a river. It meandered here and there, but also was an artifice, was something that there was an element of duplicity, of deceitfulness to it. Also then, of course, he fashioned the wings, which were a magnificent invention indeed. So it's that idea of an author like Daedalus, who is the archetype of the artist in classical Greek times, the author creating a work, but a work whose success depends upon the suffering, depends upon the author creating a protagonist who is also his victim. And then, as I said in the second of these talks, the idea itself came from the American literary critic Edmund Burke, who talked about the idea. He had the idea that an author, in order to create a perfect work, had to create as well a perfect victim. So the idea that, and it was very surprising to me, I'd been teaching for decades, and it never occurred to me, two things. First of all, that the protagonist of a work, say Jay Gatsby, is a victim. Of whom is he a victim? Tom and Daisy Buchanan, wrong answer. He's the victim of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's absolutely determined that he's going to die in the way that he does. So you have the idea of the protagonist then being the author's victim, but also the idea that of the analogy between the perfect work and the perfect protagonist. So there was no protagonist who is better suited, certainly not Nick Carraway or Tom Wilson or any of the other characters, George Wilson, Tom Buchanan, Daisy Faye Buchanan, and so on. None of them measure up. None of them have the stature, have the perfection then that qualifies Gatsby as the protagonist. Remember, there are several people who die at the end of the novel, but we're encouraged, led to care only about Gatsby himself. Okay, and then quickly moving on, so beginning with the example of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and then moving on to Dante's Inferno, to the Divine Comedy in general, I point out the relationship between Ulysses' journey. So Ulysses becomes kind of the Daedalus character, the Daedalus Icarus character. Ulysses in Canto 26 of the Inferno, who in going beyond the limits that have been set for human beings, who wants to go to a land where no people exist, so on a land unknown to other men, comes, of course, to his doom. He ends up in the Inferno. And the parallel then between that catastrophic journey undertaken by Ulysses and the journey undertaken with quite different significance then, the journey undertaken by Dante himself, under the guidance not of an impulse to go and explore a world beyond this world, but rather quite the contrary. Remember at the beginning of the second canto of the Inferno, Dante says to Virgil, "Oh no, not me, not me. I don't deserve to go down into the underworld." And it's at that point Virgil says, "It's because of Beatrice. It's because of this woman who has implored me to come and to talk with you and to lead you through the other world, the world, to be sure, which has never been seen by any living person." And of course, that point is made throughout the Inferno, that Dante has gone over to the other world, but he remains and will return, to be sure, to this world as well. So that relationship then between a journey and undertaking that leads to the victimizing of a character of Ulysses, and rather, on the other hand, leading to the glorification of the author himself, in this case, Dante. Okay, today then I'm going to talk about, in a similar way, I'm going to, continuing with this idea of what I call the Daedalus Complex, to continue, and now moving into the modern period, there are two examples that I'm going to use. One of them today then will be, the first of them today will be T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And then in the next, the fourth part of this four-part series, I'll talk about the Portuguese writer, much less familiar, to be sure, than the other authors whose names I've mentioned and whose work I've considered thus far in my presentations. The Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa, whose masterpiece, it was an extraordinary work, the Book of Disquiet, which I came to rather late in life. I think I had retired already from teaching at Washington College, which is where I am right now, on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Small liberal arts college, by the way, well worth your attention. You may not be familiar with it. I had no idea. I'd never heard of it. From New England, and I'd never been below the Mason-Dixon line before. Some 40-some years ago, I was very fortunately indeed offered the position to teach here at Washington College, and I'm very, very grateful to the administration of the college for giving me an office where I can work, even though I've been retired now for some 12 years. Okay, well, enough of that. Enough of me. Let's get on to Prufrock. much more memorable his experiences than mine. Okay, so I have my text here, and from which I'll be departing, I'm sure, every now and again, but I'll try to remain reasonably within its confines. So T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and it's written at about the same time as Pessoa, at the same time that Pessoa was beginning to work on the Book of Disquiet. It similarly expresses the very different outcomes to which, in quotations, demonic possession may lead. I have to explain that. In the second installment, where I'm talking about Hamlet, I quote, it was a eureka moment for me many years ago now, when I was reading an edition of Hamlet in which, I guess he's British, his name is Hibbard, Hibbard, G-R, Hibbard, I think it is. he talks about Shakespeare being in the grip of demonic possession as he's writing Hamlet. And what he means by that is you sense, he certainly sensed, and many of us will also, as we're reading Hamlet, just what a thrill, how exciting it was for Hamlet to be writing this play, the inventiveness, the fertility of his imagination, the beauty, of course, the very, very famous soliloquy, not only, but including those very famous soliloquies, and not only that, but just all of the various scenes of episodes that he creates in this kind of, at times, helter-skelter way. You feel that it's kind of an insanity, as it were, that's taken over him. And then, as I point out in that second talk, it can remind us of the possibility that Hamlet also is insane, that he's not only feigning insanity, but that there really is authentic insanity, and authentic, what we can call, again, using Hibbett's term, we can call it demonic possession, and a possession that creates a situation in which he's paralyzed. He can't decide what to do. He can't go this way. He can't go that way. It's as though he's in a kind of straitjacket, so that relationship between Hamlet, who's this idea came to me. It's as though Hamlet is in a straitjacket because of this demonic possession. Well, it's the demonic possession, if you will, excuse me, but gives Shakespeare wings with which he flies indeed. Okay, so in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, you have, I'll explain that in a moment, or illustrate the point that demonic possession, the significance of the outcome, the implications of demonic possession depend on whether we apply that term to Prufrock himself or to T.S. Eliot as his creator. I didn't mention this, but in the second talk, I use the phrases, when I talk about the relationship between the Daedalus Complex and the Oedipus Complex. The Daedalus Complex is triangular, as the Oedipus Complex is, but in place of mother, father, child, or son, you have what I call the designing author. The designing author, the design of his work, and the third term, the designated victim, who is the protagonist. So you have designing, you have design, and designated, and it's the interplay of those three terms, which are very different from each other, but also, of course, very, very similar. There's a kind of collusion, a kind of unification, as it were, between them. Okay, where am I going? All right, so there are no actual demons in Prufrock, yet we constantly sense the oppressive influence throughout the poem of what Eliot called the Eliot way. He used this term to explain, it's a wonderfully ambiguous term, as you'll see in a moment. He used this term to explain his mother's inability to decide whether to visit him in England, in which he described it then as an affliction that makes it impossible for any members of my family to make up their minds. James Longenbach, the American literary critic then, tells us that in an uncollected essay about Henry Adams, to whom Eliot was distantly related, he referred to the Eliot way more generally as, more impersonally, I suppose we could say, he referred to the Eliot way as the Boston doubt. And he defined the Boston doubt as a skepticism which is difficult to explain to those who were not born to it. This skepticism, Eliot went on, is a product or a cause or a concomitant of Unitarianism. Wherever someone infected with the Eliot way stepped, this is a quotation, wherever someone infected with the Eliot way stepped, the ground did not simply give way, it flew into particles. Such people, and this is really interesting, such people want to do something great, said Eliot, but they are predestined failures. So wanting to do something great, the conflict then between wanting to do something great but being a predestined failure is very quickly, maybe to make the point, maybe to underline it even too obviously, the predestined failure is Prufrock himself, that Eliot projects that predestined failure onto Prufrock, who's kind of a scapegoat, a victim, to be sure, for Eliot, and that Eliot achieves something great, one of the greatest modernist poems, and maybe even his own greatest poem, in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That may be rather a minority view, but I think if I had to name the poem by Eliot that has the most powerful impact on me and that I think is the most immortal of his poems, I'm quite sure that it would be Prufrock. Onward. In a remark that will remind us of Eliot's distinction between the man who suffers and the mind which creates, Langenbach then goes on to argue that, and it's quoting, Eliot's first great artistic success grew from the effort to distance himself from the threat of such failure by dramatizing it. So he says dramatizing is pretty much what I mean when I say projecting upon the figure of Prufrock. Not only the voice, and this is still Langenbach, not only the voice, but the very linguistic texture of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock embodies the typically Eliotic stalemate between fortitude and inertia. Fortitude and inertia, and maybe the idea that the inertia in the poem is highly visible indeed. We're reminded of it at every moment as we read the poem. But we have to realize, too, that there is this invisible fortitude on Eliot's part, and let's say, without being too clever, a fortitude that leads him to forge this poem, in the positive sense of forge, to make as Daedalus made the wings, to forge the poem in a very meticulous way, indeed, a way that gives wings again to the poem, a poem about someone who otherwise is in a straitjacket. Okay, among the many details that point to Eliot's displacement of what he calls the Eliot way, and the Eliot way itself, it's an ambiguous term. It's quite clever, I suppose, on Eliot's part. You think, well, the Eliot way, that means you're going somewhere, as it were. It's du côté chez Swann, as it were, in Proust. It's Swann's way, or the Eliot way. It's a path that leads you somewhere. But no, for Eliot, it's whenever you take a step, the ground goes to pieces beneath your feet. So among the many details that point to Eliot's displacement of the Eliot way onto Prufrock, we notice, even before Prufrock's soliloquy begins, that Eliot has prefaced it with a passage from Inferno 26, in which, it's 26 is 27, isn't it? Yeah, it must be 27 because Ulysses is 26. 27, in which Guido de Montefeltro faces a potentially paralyzing conflict. On the one hand, he wants to tell the story of his misdeeds to Dante, but on the other, he wants to avoid harming his reputation among the living. No sooner does he raise the specter of the impasse to which this conflict could potentially lead, however, than he resolves it by reminding himself that no one, including wrongly, he assumes, no one, including Dante himself, has ever returned from this abyss alive. Of course, Dante is going to return, and he's going to write out the whole story of Guido in Canto 27 of the Inferno. Prufrock's situation is, unfortunately for him, a mirror inversion of Guido's. He begins with a forceful decision Let us go then, you and I, but then runs afoul of the Eliot way, which makes him almost immediately reluctant to pursue the overwhelming question, which, given Prufrock's state of mind, may be overwhelming. But simply, why is it overwhelming? Maybe simply because it's a question, and any question is overwhelming. So the overwhelming question, the phrase itself, we can think of as amounting to a redundancy. As a result, the "let us go" with which this paragraph begins returns at the end of the poem in the form, returns at the end of the paragraph itself, the first paragraph at the beginning of the poem, the verse paragraph, returns at the end in the form of a deferral. Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit. A similar pattern may be observed in the paragraph beginning with the optimistic announcement that, and indeed there will be time, but ends with yet another reversal, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. The Eliot way subsequently emerges to obstruct Prufrock's journey when he doubts that he has sufficient courage to face other people whom he is convinced will surely notice his thinning hair. For Prufrock, this relatively trivial uncertainty leads him to formulate a characteristically rhetorical question that guarantees his inaction. Do I dare disturb the universe? Well, presumably not. Later in the poem, Prufrock, having by this point clearly decided not to undertake the journey that he had initially proposed, asks himself by way of self-justification, would it have been worth it after all? A phrase that he intones 5 times, and to which he responds implicitly in the negative by invoking a purely hypothetical obstruction in the form of a woman who, settling a pillow by her head, should say, "That is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all." As Langenbach observes, still Langenbach then, however, the Eliot way is countermanded, and I'm quoting from him, the Eliot way is countermanded by a willed decisiveness, a determination to act that is nurtured so privately that to anyone else it appears irrational. So there's what he had referred to previously as fortitude, the fortitude that we find embodied then in Eliot himself. There is, as it were, a second Eliot way that allows Eliot to displace the paralyzing capacity of the first Eliot way onto Prufrock, and then to transmute the event of Prufrock's suffering into a work of art. I should pause this for a moment and explain. In another talk, I point out Eliot in his very famous essay, it used to be at least very famous, Tradition and the Individual Talent. He makes the claim, he states that the distinction between the events that occur in a literary work, say, and the work itself is absolute. The distinction between event and art will always be absolute. Among the signs of the second Eliot way, we notice that Eliot writes in the form of a dramatic monologue, a poem that artfully draws upon, in both obvious and not so obvious ways, 2 of the greatest masterpieces of Western literature, Dante's Inferno and Shakespeare's Hamlet. From Hamlet, he has borrowed both the content of the poem, Prufrock's, in the sense that Prufrock's indecision, we could say, revisits Hamlet's indecision. So both in its content and in its form, in the sense that Prufrock's monologues revisit Hamlet's soliloquies, maybe less obviously than, but I don't know if either of them is obvious, but once it's been pointed out, I think that those two connections on the levels both of content and form do create a mirroring relationship between Hamlet and the poem, the love song, the play Hamlet, and the poem, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. We also observe that one of the poem's most famous lines, "No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be," points not only to Shakespeare's play, but also to the line in Inferno, in the second canto of the Inferno, where Dante says, I am no Aeneas or Paul, or I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul, however you translate it. That's what I mentioned before, when he doesn't feel worthy to go down into or to pursue this journey into the afterlife. But so that when he says, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be, of course the to be is in there, to be or not to be, he's also echoing, much less obviously to be sure, the one of those opening lines of the second canto of the Inferno, in which Dante himself invokes refers to his unworthiness. Eliot's adaptations of the Inferno begin, of course, with his using a passage from Canto 27 as the epigraph to Prufrock, and concludes, and that's the very beginning. It's interesting, by the way, to notice there are any number of readings of quite famous actors at times reading reading Prufrock. And I was just thinking, one that I remember from not too long ago was Anthony Hopkins, very distinguished English actor, who begins with, "Let us go then, you and I." He doesn't quote the Italian. And I'm not sure, I don't think that Eliot himself, who if I remember correctly, recorded the poem, I don't think he quotes the Italian either. But anyway, it is there. And it is a passage then from a snippet from Canto 27 with the Guido canto, and concludes with a 3-line stanza, an allusion to Dante's terza rima. Remember, Dante invented this poetic form with three lines rhyming A, B, A, and the next would be B, C, B, and on from there. So, and he, not only in the form of the poem, but also the content, because remembering that Ulysses drowns at the end of Canto 26, and now Prufrock will be drowned by human voices. These are the 3 lines then towards the end, the very end. In fact, Prufrock says, "We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown." It's the conclusion of the poem. What's the very beginning of the poem? Prufrock compares himself to a patient who's etherized upon a table in the sense of unconsciousness, and here at the very end of the poem, he imagines himself as drowning, so it's very nice. I'm probably not going, well, I'll have something to say about this a bit later, the way in which the poem is written in the form of a chiasm, as Shakespeare's Hamlet is as well. The entire play, as I point out in the second installment of these talks, that the play Hamlet is in the form of a chiasm, in which after the play, within the play, the second part of Hamlet mirrors the first part. I won't go back into that now, but to realize, and if you have your copy of Prufrock with you, right at the dead center, there are 131 lines in the poem, 131, kind of an interesting arrangement or numerical, a buried, to be sure, an invisible presence in a kind of numerological way. But right at the dead center of the poem, you have that rhymed couplet, "Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress?" And you could figure it out yourself. I may say a few words about it later, though it gets a little complicated. You can notice, if you look at the poem, if you look at what Prufrock is talking about just before that couplet and what he's talking about right after, you see, oh yeah, there's kind of a mirroring relationship. And then if you do it, the next step further away, further up, further down, see, oh yeah, again, a mirroring relationship. Okay, moving on. Additional literary allusions remind us of the distinction between Prufrock, who is describing a lived experience that exemplifies the Eliot way. In other words, Prufrock, who is the perfect victim, and T.S. Eliot, who is writing the poem under the very different influences of his literary precursors, that allows him to distance himself from his designated surrogate, his designated victim, as I have said already. When Prufrock assures himself in a palpably delaying maneuver that there will be time, Eliot is artfully echoing, everyone catches this, or most everyone, Eliot is artfully echoing a line from Andrew Marvell's poem, To His Coy Mistress, an erotic poem, to be sure, one of the most famous erotic poems. So it's rather this erotic poem, rather ironic indeed, that Prufrock, such a person as himself, would be echoing Marvell's poem. His certainty that there will be time for, and this is in Prufrock, for all the works and days, echoes the title of a poem by the Greek poet then Hesiod. His evocation, this is Prufrock, his evocation of a bracelet of bright hair is a direct borrowing from John Donne's The Relic. His fantasy of his heads being brought in upon a platter revisits the fate of John the Baptist. His wondering, and would it have been worth it after all to have squeezed the universe into a ball, is yet another rewriting of a quite famous image indeed from Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. So all of these signs of regret, of impotence, of an inability, of a paralysis, of being all tied up in knots, as it were, from the point making Prufrock the perfect victim, also contributes to the making of Prufrock the poem as a perfect poem indeed, through its incorporation of the work of the great masters. The two meanings of the term Eliot way, as both obstacle and path, apply as well to the combination of randomness and orderly design that characterizes the poem as a whole, in a way that may remind us of Hamlet, whose series of individual scenes may seem random. It's very helter-skelter, and oftentimes directors of his plays will simply cut out scenes. Throw this one away. We don't really need it. It doesn't contribute to the unfolding of the main action of the play. So this kind of helter-skelter quality that you find even in randomness that you find in Hamlet returns, to be sure, in Prufrock, where Prufrock seems to be going, he does seem to be anesthetized upon a table, and his mind is wandering in all kinds of directions. So it seems random. Transitions between disparate verse paragraphs of Prufrock often seem abrupt, or at the very least, not governed by a discernible principle. We begin with a journey through half-deserted streets. then shift to a couplet describing women who talk of Michelangelo, then to a paragraph, to a couplet, to one organized around an extended metaphor. It is a paragraph, an extended metaphor comparing the yellow fog to a cat that rubs its back upon the window panes, and the yellow smoke to a cat that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. Such unpredictable shifts as these continue to reappear throughout the poem. At the same time, however, we notice that Eliot transmutes the randomness of Prufrock's wandering journey into a strictly controlled formal pattern, so the formal design of a poem that's made and very, very carefully constructed, invisibly constructed to be sure, as the kind of the foundation, the invisible foundation then of the wanderings to which Eliot subjects his designated victim. So again, that relationship between designated victim and the formal design of the work itself. The center of this, well, I'm repeating then a point that I included previously. The center of this 131-line poem, the number itself suggests the presence of a submerged but nonetheless conscious design, is the couplet. I might mention just very briefly, it was Ezra Pound advised Eliot that he should get rid of, and I'm not quite remembering what passage it was. I think it might be, I am not Hamlet, nor was meant to be. In any event, there was a passage that he wanted Eliot to get rid of. Eliot insisted on keeping it, and maybe one of the reasons is Eliot's counting the lines of the poem and wants to have that quite resonant number. Okay, so, and as I mentioned then, right at the center you have the couplet, is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress. Oh, which I point out, I'd forgotten this. That couplet contains, whether by design or not, 13 syllables. You can count them if you want. So we have that pattern of 1-3 again that may, and it may echo back, why not? It may resonate with, it may revisit Dante's terza rima, with the unity of the verse being combining with or being accompanied by, being fleshed out by a 3-line stanza. So a unified stanza of 3 lines. Well, so I get into some rather technical points, which I'm not going to repeat. The tightly controlled formal aspects of these 2 lines, as well as their placement at the very center of Prufrock, contrasts suggestively with the implications of the word digress. That's actually an interesting point, and I'd forgotten about it, though I made it a while ago, that that word digress suggests there's all of this wandering, but Eliot rhymes it with dress and creates a rather neatly enclosed couplet in that way. I'm going to, I'll summarize real quickly rather than going into all the details. And as I've said with some of these other talks, if at times I refer to a diagram, which I don't know how you do what's that called? Where you would show. Maybe sometime I'll get someone up at the tech, the IoT, the help desk, they call it at the college, to show me how I would put in a text, for example, that would diagram, that would illustrate a point. I'll just say, well, so two things, that if you ever want me to send you something, just get in touch with me. I'm on Facebook. You can email me at Washington College, or even on YouTube itself. A couple of times it's happened with I have a video that I did years ago on on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. If you're interested, you just put in Cousineau Gatsby on YouTube and it'll come up. It's called Plagiarism Unbound, Borrowing Desire in The Great Gatsby. And someone asked me, for example, well, would you give me that list of 10 different things that you talked about? And I said, oh, sure, here it is. And I put it up on YouTube. So that would be, what I'm getting around to is that there's a critic, a reader of the poem then, named R.G. Peterson, who I don't know anything else about him, except he wrote an essay on Prufrock that I found really amazing, and that I've incorporated into the talk. What he points out is that if you in the show it to you if you can, whoops, see what he does. That with that X is the couplet right in the middle. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? And what he points out is that there are 9 divisions, episodes, segments, maybe would be a better word. There are 9 segments. Now, of course, there are 9 circles in Dante's Inferno, you remember. 9 segments leading up to that couplet right in the middle, and then 9 segments, but again, in the form of a chiasm. So going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up through 9, and then 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and the 1, we'll illustrate it with this. The 1 is what I referred to before. He's a patient etherized upon a table at the very beginning, and then he's drowning at the very end. So rather an obvious sort of thing, an obvious kind of parallel, echoing relationship. And as Peterson points out, and I don't have the title of his essay with me, but if for those of you who do research or are interested in the subject, if you just go like to the MLA bibliography or JSTOR, something like that, and put in R.J. Peterson, The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, it'll come up, and it's quite fascinating, I find, or at least, and among other things, the way in which it shows the way in which all of Prufrock's wandering, his avoiding the overwhelming question. Eliot is not avoiding the very center of his poem. He's going directly to it, and then he mirrors it in this kind of regressive way throughout the second part. It's very much like what happens in Hamlet. And again, I have a very detailed diagram of the entirety of Hamlet. If any of you ever want to see it, I'll gladly send it along to you. Okay, one final paragraph, and then I'll be going on to Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, but that'll be part 4. That'll be for another time. The concentric design of it's in circle composition then. We could say I use the word chiasm more frequently, but it's also circle composition. So you have the big circle with number 1 at the beginning, number 1 at the end, then the smaller circle that joins number 2 at the beginning, number 2 at the end, then number 3. I'm not going to go on and on this way, but you understand the way in which these concentric circles form. So the concentric design of the poem that's revealed, and I think so masterfully and the uncanny concentric design of the poem then is revealed by Peterson. And I would never have seen it if I hadn't read his article. Excuse me. The concentric design of the poem, like the labyrinth in the Daedalus story, the nine circles of Dante's Inferno, and the chiastic structure of Hamlet point ambiguously both to victimage and to mastery. So that idea of the perfect victim for Prufrock and the perfect work, the perfect display, the work then that amounts to the perfect display of the mastery of the author. Peterson emphasizes the former, the idea of victimage, when he interprets it, the concentric circles, as signifying the extreme self-centeredness of the ineffectual lover. So, and again, right in the very middle, you have the couplet, "Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress?" So there's good reason indeed to adopt Peterson's reading. Yet to be sure, Eliot's deceitful shaping of Prufrock's hapless dithering into a modernist labyrinth is equally a tribute to his skill as a literary architect, in whose work we discover, in Eliot's own words, that the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. I'm not sure that the meaning of that phrase and what I have in mind is entirely clear. So I'll just conclude by saying that, remember, Prufrock is always concerned about the voices of the dying fall. What are they going to say? My thinning hair and all this stuff. Oh, how his arms and legs are thin. And over and over again, these references to hearing other people. What are they going to say about me? This sort of thing. But Prufrock is trapped, as it were, again, in a straitjacket because of these voices of other people. Eliot very famously, in his essay, The Tradition and the Individual Talent, talks about the voices of his dead, of the writer's dead ancestors. And so you have Shakespeare and Marvell and Dante and Baudelaire and so many others that are about to say scattered, but they're more integrated into the quite extraordinary, quite masterful achievement then, which is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So if you've stayed with me this far, again, many thanks, and perhaps see you on for the fourth of the installments on so is the Book of Disquiet that I came upon in just in the most happenstance way, and quite late in my life, though I was still teaching here at Washington College. I was just in a bookstore and I see this book, the book of, and it had a blurb from one of my favorite contemporary English writers. I don't know how well he's known, but I liked his work so much, named Paul Bailey. And Paul said something on this edition of the Book of Disquiet about how it says, it's the best thing I've read in a long, long time. And he says, even the narrator's lugubriousness is exhilarating. And I said, oh, wow, I have to have this book. And I bought it, and just, again, I felt the exhilaration that Paul had as well, and which I'll be sharing with those of you who return for the fourth in this series on the Daedalus Complex. Okay, bye-bye.